Good morning. It is Monday, April 20th, 2015. This is your morning edition on I-24 News. Coming up later today, 700 migrants are feared dead after a boat capsizes in the Mediterranean Sea off the Libyan coast. As the first deadline for forming a new government looms next week, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu seems nowhere near finalizing a coalition. And later on the show, today marks the biggest annual celebration of cannabis culture. Yes, it's Pot Day. We'll take a closer look. Good morning, I'm Yael Levi, and we begin with the latest tragedy in the Mediterranean Sea. 700, yes, that number is 700 migrants are feared to have drowned after their boat was capsized in the Mediterranean Sea. So far, only 28 people have been rescued and 24 bodies retrieved. Now, since the beginning of this year, at least 900 other migrants have died crossing the Mediterranean on their way to what they hope will be a better life. If confirmed, the death toll would bring the number to 1,500 of dead people since the beginning of the year, resulting from a flow of migrants seeking to flee insecurity in sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East. Since 2000, almost 22,000 people have died fleeing across the Mediterranean. Only last week, around 400 migrants were reported to have died attempting to reach Italy as well from Libya when their boat capsized. Italy's Prime Minister Matteo Renzi called an emergency meeting of the EU this week, stating that the situation in the Mediterranean is a daily massacre and one that Europe cannot remain insensitive to. To further discuss this, we are joined in studio by the Director of the Center for European Studies at the IDC in Herzliya, Dr. Esther Lupatin. Dr. Lupatin, good morning to you. Before we break it down, let's take a look at the following report and break it down from there.
Concern is growing for as many as 700 African migrants feared killed when their ship sunk on its way to Europe.
A boat full of migrants capsized last night, about 60 nautical miles off the Libyan coast. I make a heartfelt appeal to the international community to react decisively and quickly to see to it that such tragedies are not repeated.
The accident reportedly occurred when the migrants, boarding a ship making its way from Egypt to Europe, shifted abruptly to one side of the overcrowded vessel as a merchant ship approached. The tragedy is the fourth over the past week in which migrants have been killed making the dangerous journey across the Mediterranean from Africa to the shores of Europe. Since the beginning of 2015, a total of 1,500 migrants have lost their lives, a figure which is rapidly advancing towards an unwanted all-time record.
We're talking about a death toll this year that's already 10 times what it was last year. And when you recall that we reported, I think, 3,179 deaths in the Mediterranean last year, if this trend were to continue, we'd be talking about over 30,000, and that's quite alarming.
The new deaths have fueled calls for a stronger response. The European Union announced a meeting of foreign and interior ministers to address what is being described as a, quote, systematic slaughter in the Mediterranean.
Rescue efforts for migrants will need more boats, more overflights, and much more intense battle against the trafficking of people.
They are men and women like us, our brothers seeking a better life. I ask you to pray, first in silence, then all together for these brothers and sisters.
First joined from Rome by the Director of the Coordination Office for the Mediterranean International Organization for Migration, Federico Soda. Mr. Soda, good morning to you.
Good morning.
Let's start by the situation right now. First of all, what do we know? How many are presumed dead? And how is Italy dealing with this specific yesterday's tragedy?
Well, some of the eyewitness accounts that are coming in now from some of the survivors are suggesting that we may have a far higher rate of fatalities, looking at possibly up to 900 or perhaps that number.
Right.
So it's a very, very disturbing and troubling situation. We unfortunately, we're coming across these events more and more regularly, with over 1,500 people dying this year. If this number is verified, the 900, we're going to be close to probably 1,800 or 1,900 since January 1st.
Now, when it comes to your organization, the International Organization for Migration, I'm assuming that you are, begging or asking Europe, the continent, for more help. What can be done? What should be done to try to try and actually prevent these horrific, what we call, what seems to be a Holocaust in the middle of the Mediterranean? What can be done?
We need a wide range of policies, and right now the focus on the policies and the responses is quite narrow. Saving lives is the immediate short-term priority. I think this has been made abundantly clear in the last few weeks and months. The second thing is we have to work on stabilizing countries that are the source of conflict and violence, and reinforcing those that are stable. And we can't forget that a lot more work needs to be done offshore, because ultimately the roots of these flows and the motivation for a lot of these people leaving is overseas, including an economic inequality and violence. And so it's far more than just a Mediterranean issue. It's something that affects us all.
Completely. No, the bigger picture, which we're touching on in a minute, do stay with us. We'll be joined shortly also from Geneva by the Senior Communications Officer for Europe, West Africa at the UNHCR, Mr. Spindler. Mr. William Spindler, good morning to you.
Good morning.
I just want to ask you, when it comes to the policy itself, what is the policy right now in Europe?
Well, the policy at the moment is to try to keep people away, and it's clearly not working. What we would like to see is a more concerted effort by the European Union and the member states of the European Union to work together rather than in isolation. At the moment, countries like Italy and Greece are receiving by far the most refugees and migrants, and they're clearly finding it really difficult to rescue them at sea.
No, and speaking of, as you mentioned, Greece, geographically, those are the countries that the migrants are going to try and get to. But Greece, for example, financially, we know that situation. Everybody's staying with us. Dr. Esther Lupatin, that's my direction to you. This is not going to stop. No. Is Europe, is it equipped, or is Europe equipped to deal with this problem, or is it also a question of a lack of want to try and help?
Well, I think there's a lack of interest in Europe, actually, to have a more soft immigration policy. In light of the public outcry, many Europeans actually, and we see it all the time in opinion polls, are not happy and with actually EU immigration policy. They think the immigration policy is too soft, too lenient, that allows too many family members and refugees entering the EU.
Right.
And if you look at the statistics, in 2013, we had like more than 400,000 applications for asylum. In 2014, there were 635,000 applications for asylum, which if you look at 2006, 2007, the numbers were actually much more smaller. So in general, it would be a kind of like political suicide if, let's say a prime minister or a president of any European states would say, well, we should have like more soft European policy and allow more refugees to come. What we're likely to going to see here, indeed, the Venzi call actually to an emergency meeting.
Right.
What we're going to see is probably like more restrictive measures, unfortunately. What's going to happen now, EU already have since 2004 the Frontex, which actually it's a kind of like land, naval, and air surveillance patrol to make sure that the boats are not going to take off anyhow, from Libya or any other non-European countries to the EU. That's the idea, to prevent it in the first place. But apparently, they will have to do more, and I think that's what we're going to see more and more, like Europe actually going to have more and more restrictive measures to prevent from boats actually starting the journey to Europe.
And that's a frightening thing, because many of the migrants aboard these ships hail from Libya, where years of civil war and sectarian strife have forced thousands to flee the country, and the recent emergence of ISIS on the scene has only made matters worse and contributed to the rush to leave. And sadly, also yesterday, in a very macabre way, ISIS releases a new video of them slaughtering Ethiopian Christians. Let's have a look. This is the latest atrocity of ISIS on the web. This is a short clip of, the lead-up to what was released yesterday.
The Lord and cherisher of the world, and may peace and blessings be upon the Prophet Muhammad, to the nation of the cross. We are back again on the sands where the companions of the Prophet, peace be upon him, have stepped on before, telling you, Muslim blood that was shed under the hands of your religion is not cheap. In fact, their blood is the purest blood, because there's a nation behind them inherits revenge. And we swear to Allah, the one who disgraced you by our hands, you will not have safety, even in your dreams, until you embrace Islam. As Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, stated, I was commanded to fight people until they testify that there is no true God except Allah.
It is such religious feuds that do not end when the migrants leave their homes. Just last week, reports surfaced that a group of Muslim migrants threw 15 Christians that shared their boat into the water, killing them en route to the European shores. Mr. Soda, I want to go back to you in Italy, because it was the Italian Prime Minister, and I know you're not speaking for him, but that said that this is a massacre, it's a Holocaust in the Mediterranean. Italy is not equipped to deal with this. What does it need from Europe? Because the search and rescue that is ongoing right now, as you said, specific immediate actions. I mean, for example, this morning, search and rescue, can the Italians handle this current search and rescue?
I mean, Italy right now is basically dealing with this crisis with the resources that it regularly has available in the course of its usual patrolling and operations in the Mediterranean. It had a large-scale operation called Mare Nostrum. That was a search and rescue operation. They saved tens of thousands of lives in 2013 and 2014 with that operation. But we're basically under pressure to close it by other European member states, as well as by the fact that they're the only ones financing it at about 10 million euros per month. So we know that more can be done. It's a matter of political will and leadership to do it, and solidarity within the European Union to respond to this emergency.
Now, Mr. Soda, wise words, and I want to thank you for joining us, and hopefully people will hear it. I want to thank you for joining us this morning. Dr. Lupatin, it's this type of solidarity that Mr. Soda was speaking of that is needed here. But if Italy, for example, it's turned to other countries, right? It has turned to other countries for help.
And well, we've seen it like many years ago, actually, in Yugoslavia crisis, you know, when the first time, like when Germany was asking for help, when they got 350,000 Bosnians, and they asked the French to help them out, and they shared the burden, and the French said, well, we're sorry, you will have to deal it by yourself. The problem with the EU in the moment, like, according to Dublin Convention that was ratified in 1997, the EU actually is saying one thing. The first country to accept refugees had to deal with them.
Yeah.
And that's a problem. You cannot share, you know, the number of refugees that have been admitted to Italy with other European countries. That's it, unless other countries are willing to do so. But the EU member states at the time promised that they will give so-called money, you know, burden sharing mechanism and provide help. But in reality, we haven't seen that. And Italy, you know, has been asking for so many years, you know, like especially since 2011, you know, in light of the Arab Spring and the flight of so many, like, Tunisians, Egyptians, you know,
that so many came across.
No, and eventually the reaction was in 2012, Germany and France were saying, well, they were actually blaming the Italians and the Greeks, and they were saying that Greeks is not doing a good job to guard their borders, and Italians allow actually other refugees to go to other European countries. And in 2011, we saw that France, as a reaction, as a fear to get so many Tunisians to Italy, they actually reintroduced the border control and temporarily shut down the Schengen between them and Italy. So that's something that also is likely to happen, that member states are likely to reintroduce border control between them, between EU member states, in order not to get refugees.
In order not to get refugees, which begs the question, and we're also joined in studio by research fellow at the INSS, Dr. Sarah Feinberg. I know this is not your specific form of expertise, but I'm wondering out loud with the two of you. It's also a little bit indicative on how the EU itself cannot get along between each other, because this is a problem that needs to be solved across, you know, between all of them together, correct? In many ways.
Right. Unfortunately, there are two fields in which the EU is getting along altogether. We see it's with regards to Israel. We have a strong consensus on this matter, with Germany, you know, deviating from this all EU-based norm, and Russia. And maybe that is the reason why there is such a strong emphasis on those two areas. Yeah. Because we're seeing a real crisis of coming up with a common foreign policy making within the EU, because it works according to the principle of the unanimity of voices.
The unanimity of voices, speaking of which, you know, and in the case of the migrants, though, Dr. Lupatin, because we're not going to see a stop as we know, the region that we're sitting in right now, all three of us, is going to supply many more refugees, many more people who are going to try and cross borders. That's also, we can link the rise of the right wing to it in Europe.
Absolutely. That's actually, if you look at the platform of Marine Le Pen or also Strache from Austria, that's what they're saying. Le Pen is saying we want to make sure that to reduce dramatically the number of immigrants who are coming to Europe, and especially from the Middle East. That's the thing. You know, the thing is that most refugees are coming from the Middle East. And in Europe today, there is ongoing debate about not only whether or not immigrants constitute a threat to the dominant culture, but the question now in Europe, unlike in the US, the debate is whether or not they constitute a threat to our personal security. So there's another dimension. So like those refugees are not coming from Asia, you know, they're not coming from Christian countries, they're coming from Muslim countries. And that actually like complicates the whole thing, and also the lack of political will to help them.
The lack of political will and the lack of, I mean, there are many things that can be said, but I mean, Italy trying to face the situation as it is somewhat commendable in many ways. But as you said, be it Islam or what the migrants are facing also in the middle of the sea, as we saw last week with 15 Christians, and then slaughtered in Libya itself by ISIS. Just a terrifying notion, and sadly we're not seeing a type of policy that is all-consuming. Just really quickly to conclude this, in this type of emergency meeting that Renzi has called for, what do you think can be decided just in the immediate future? Or will they come out with something?
I am pretty sure that that's what's going to happen, like based on conclusions of different European Council from 2001, 2002, like about immigration. They are likely to come up with more restrictive measures. And like having more like a patrol and to make sure that the boats are not going to leave, because you know it's a bad PR for the European Union, for the Europe.
So they look like they're not taking people in,
course,
as long as they just don't get here. Sad truth. But Dr. Lupatin, thank you as you stay locked in studio with us. We move along.